Frank Herbert spent 6 years building one of the most beloved heroes in science fiction, and he did it for one strange reason. He wanted readers to fall completely in love with Paul Atreides so that their love could become his warning. Dune looks like the oldest comforting story there is, a boy who loses everything and rises to set the world right. Herbert spent the rest of his life trying to explain that the warm feeling at the end was the trap. Underneath the spice and the sandworms, Dune is a long, patient warning about power. Its deepest claim is that power's true danger lives somewhere we rarely look. The danger is the quiet human willingness to hand our judgment to someone wonderful, to stop thinking for ourselves, and to call that surrender hope. Over the next few hours, we will follow that single thread, slowly, through every throne and prophecy and war in the saga. Welcome to Serial Souls. Let's begin. Section 1. The Trouble with Heroes. A writer named Frank Herbert spent about 6 years quietly gathering the pieces of a story before he ever sat down to write it out. The book that came from all that gathering was Dune, and it reached readers in 1965. On its surface, it looks like the oldest and warmest story human beings have ever told. A boy loses his father to a cruel enemy. The boy is driven out into a vast desert with nothing. He learns the hard ways of a hard people. He grows into something powerful, and in the end, he rises up and brings down the men who destroyed his family. He takes a throne. The cruel are punished. The ones who suffered are lifted up at last. Most people who finish that story for the first time close the book feeling warm and satisfied, as though the world has finally been set right. Herbert spent a good part of the rest of his life trying to tell people that this warm, satisfied feeling was the trap he had built. Dune is set far in the future, on a dry planet of endless sand called Arrakis. The boy at the center of it is Paul Atreides, the young son of a respected and gentle ruler. When the story begins, Paul is easy to love. He is brave without being cruel. He is clever and kind, loyal to his family, gentle with people below his station. Everything about how he is written invites a reader to lean toward him and hope for him. So when his father is betrayed and killed, and Paul is left alone in the desert, the reader follows him with their whole heart. And as Paul gathers the desert people around him and begins to turn from a hunted boy into a leader they would die for, that hope only grows stronger. The pull a reader feels toward Paul is not an accident, and it is not a mistake in the writing. Herbert built that pull on purpose, with great care, because he needed the reader to feel it before he could show them what it costs. Long before the films, long before the book became famous around the world, Herbert sat down and wrote out plainly why he had made Dune the way he did. In an essay about how the story came to be, he laid out a simple and uncomfortable idea. He said that great heroes, the larger-than-life kind that crowds gather around and worship, are dangerous for ordinary people. He went further than that. He said that even if a true and good hero somehow appears, the structure of power that forms around such a person does not stay good for long, because ordinary, flawed human beings always end up running it. Heroes, he wrote, are painful. The biggest heroes of all are a kind of disaster, because when a single adored leader makes a mistake, that mistake lands on every single person who followed him. That is the quiet engine underneath the whole book. Paul is not written as a warning sign you can see coming. He is written as the most appealing person in the room, so that the reader will make the exact mistake Herbert wanted to study, which is the mistake of handing your trust and your judgment to one shining person and then refusing to take it back. Herbert was careful to say that the problem he cared about was not really the leaders themselves. The problem he kept circling back to was us, the people who follow. In one of his clearest moments, he explained that Dune was aimed at the whole idea of the leader who can do no wrong, because his reading of history told him a hard truth. When a leader makes a mistake, or when a mistake is made in that leader's name, the size of the damage grows with the number of people who follow along without ever stopping to ask a question. A single foolish choice by one person is small. The same choice, multiplied by millions of obedient followers, becomes a catastrophe. He did not leave that idea floating in the air. He pointed straight at real history to show what he meant. He reminded readers that in 1978, more than 900 people followed one man so completely that when he told them to, they drank poison and died. He pointed to how a whole nation once chanted the name of its leader and then went on to murder millions of innocent people. He pointed to how a powerful country followed a beloved president into a long and bloody war that swallowed countless lives. In every case, the leader mattered far less than the crowd's willingness to switch off its own thinking and trust completely. Herbert even named the leaders people tend to admire most, and he refused to let them off the hook. Among his favorite examples were a famous American president and a famous American general. Two men remembered as glowing and grand. Two men who had carefully dressed themselves up to seem bigger than life. Look closely, he said, and you find that neither one was actually bigger than life. Each of them was, underneath the shine, an ordinary human being who made ordinary human mistakes, the same as anyone. The shine was something the crowd painted on. The mistakes were real. And because so many people trusted the shine, the mistakes spread far. Around the time the films were being made, Herbert sat for an interview and described, in plain words, exactly what he had been trying to do with Paul. He said he had worked hard to build a leader who would be attractive and easy to believe in, a leader who rose for good reasons rather than bad ones. Then, he said, power comes to that good leader. The leader begins making choices, and some of those choices are made on behalf of millions upon millions of people. And some of those choices, made with the best of intentions, do not work out well at all. That short description is the spine of the entire saga. A good man, given enormous power by adoring people, ends up causing harm on a scale that no single person should ever be able to reach. Inside the book itself, Herbert hid his warning in plain sight, in a line spoken by one of the few clear-eyed people in the story. A man who studies the desert planet and understands its people. He says that no greater disaster could fall upon a people than for them to fall into the hands of a hero. It is a strange thing to read in the middle of what looks like a hero's tale. A reader can pass right over it the first time, swept along by hope for Paul. But that single line is Herbert tapping the reader on the shoulder, gently, telling them what is really happening while they cheer. And Paul does win. That is the part that fools people. He defeats his enemies. He takes the throne. By the measure of the old, comforting story, he gets everything a hero is supposed to get. Yet the moment his power becomes complete, the desert people who love him pour out across the galaxy in his name, carrying a holy war from world to world. Billions of people die in that war. Paul, the gentle boy readers adored, becomes the still center of the largest slaughter the galaxy has ever known. And the most painful part is that he can see it coming and cannot stop it. The love that lifted him up turns into a flood, and the flood drowns far more people than the cruel enemies he set out to punish ever did. Here is where the real strangeness of Dune shows itself. When the book first came out, huge numbers of readers walked away cheering for Paul anyway. They had felt the warm satisfaction Herbert built into the ending, and they held on to it. They saw a triumphant hero, a chosen one, a savior who set the world right, and they wanted to be like him. The warning sailed straight over their heads. Herbert had spent years building a careful trap meant to teach people to distrust their own hunger for a savior. And a great many people fell into the trap, and then thanked him for the lovely feeling. Years after Dune, Herbert went back and wrote a second book to make the warning impossible to miss. In that follow-up story, he refused to let Paul stay a shining hero. He showed the cost of the Holy War up close. He showed the empty rooms inside a man who is worshipped as a god. He took the very thing readers had loved and turned it slowly in the light until its darker side could not be ignored. He had said, very simply in an interview, that the lesson at the bottom of the whole series was to beware of heroes, and that people would be far better off trusting their own judgment and learning from their own honest mistakes than handing their lives to someone who seems too good to be true. The newer films built from the book lean into this harder truth more than the older ones did. They follow Paul as he changes from a grieving boy seeking justice into something colder and more frightening. A leader the audience is meant to grow uneasy around, even as the crowds inside the story fall to their knees for him. That unease is the whole point. The story is built so that, somewhere along the way, a thoughtful viewer starts to feel the gap between what the cheering crowds see and what is really happening, and starts to wonder whether the savior they were rooting for is leading anyone anywhere good. Beneath all of it sits one idea, and it is the idea this entire series of thoughts is built around. The greatest danger in Dune is not the wicked enemy who burns down a noble house. The greatest danger is the warm, trusting feeling in the chest of an ordinary person who has found someone wonderful to believe in, and who decides, quietly, to stop thinking for themselves and let that wonderful person carry the weight of every hard choice. Herbert was not asking people to give up hope, or to sneer at every leader, or to trust no one. He was asking for something smaller and harder. He was asking each person to keep a piece of their own judgment back, to never hand all of it away, no matter how good and admirable the leader in front of them appears to be. Because under every hero's mask, he believed, there is just a person who makes mistakes. And the bigger the crowd that follows that person blindly, the bigger those mistakes are allowed to grow. That is why a story that looks like a celebration of a hero is really a long, patient warning about heroes. Paul is the bait. The reader's own hope is the lesson. And once a person sees the book this way, every later story in the saga starts to read like Herbert turning the same idea over and over, asking the same gentle and difficult question. What happens to ordinary people when they decide that one person should hold all the power, and that they themselves no longer need to think? Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. There is a second question hiding just behind the first one, though, and it is darker. It is one thing to ask why crowds keep handing their trust to a single leader. It is another thing to ask what kind of person tends to end up holding that power in the first place, and why the seat at the top so often seems to fill with exactly the wrong sort of hands. Section 2. Why power finds the wrong hands. The question left hanging at the end of all this is a plain one, and Frank Herbert kept circling back to it for the rest of his life. If crowds keep handing their trust to one shining leader, then who tends to end up holding that trust once it has been handed over? The comforting answer would be that good and wise people rise to the top, since those are the people we would choose if someone asked us. Herbert did not believe the comforting answer. He believed the seat at the top of any large power tends to fill with the worst sort of person for the job. And he believed this happens not by bad luck, but by the very way power works. In one of his later books, he put the idea down in a short, cold line that has stuck with readers ever since. Every government, he wrote, keeps running into the same trouble over and over. Power does not so much turn good people rotten as draw the rotten people in. The seat of power acts like a magnet, and the thing it pulls hardest toward itself is the kind of person most eager to grab it and least bothered by what they have to do to keep it. That single thought turns the usual saying on its head. People often say that power corrupts, as though power were a poison that slowly spoils a healthy person who drinks it. Herbert is saying something stranger and more unsettling. The poison is not added later. The people who crave power for its own sake are already drawn to the throne before they ever reach it, the same way certain insects are drawn to a light in the dark. By the time someone has clawed their way to the top of a great empire, the climb itself has already sorted out the gentle and the doubtful. And what remains standing at the summit is usually a person who wanted the height more than they wanted anything else. Herbert was clear that the real danger here lives in the system, more than in any one villain. He said plainly that it was the structures themselves he found dangerous, the giant machines of rule and empire that gather power into fewer and fewer hands. Such structures, he wrote, naturally attract people who want power simply for the sake of having power, with no larger reason behind the wanting. A reader can hate a particular cruel character all they like, but Herbert keeps pointing past the character, toward the chair the character is sitting in, because the chair will keep pulling in cruel people long after that one villain is gone. Dune shows this idea instead of merely stating it, and it shows it in the most painful way possible. The story is built around the fall of a good and decent family, the Atreides, led by a duke named Leto. Herbert writes Leto as nearly everything a person could want in a leader. He is honorable. He keeps his word. He rules the people under him through loyalty and respect rather than fear, and his people love him for it, which is rare in his harsh world. He is the closest thing the book has to a fair and gentle hand on the wheel of power. And it is exactly that goodness that gets him killed. The reason behind his death is the dark heart of the whole arrangement. The most powerful man in this future, the emperor who rules over everything, has come to fear Duke Leto. The fear has nothing to do with Leto doing anything wrong. The emperor fears Leto because Leto is admired, because the other ruling families respect him, because a leader people genuinely love is the one kind of rival a distant and dreaded ruler cannot easily control. The emperor looks down from the top of all that power and sees a good man growing popular. And instead of welcoming him, he decides the good man must be destroyed before he becomes a threat. So a leader is marked for death precisely for the qualities that ought to be celebrated. The emperor does not strike openly. He hides his hand. He gives the dirty work to the Atreides family's oldest enemy, the Harkonnens, a clan led by a grossly cruel and scheming baron who wants nothing in life so much as power and the pleasure of crushing the people who stand in his way. The baron is the opposite of Duke Leto in every way that matters. He lies easily. He delights in pain. He plots for years, patient and gleeful, to wipe out the family he hates. And he is exactly the sort of person the system keeps rewarding, while the good duke is exactly the sort it keeps grinding down. To make the trap work, the emperor lends the baron his own private soldiers, the most feared fighters in the known worlds, and he dresses them in the baron's colors so that no one will know the truth. Under cover of night, with the help of a trusted insider who has been broken into betrayal, the two powers fall on the Atreides together. The good duke is destroyed. His household is scattered or slaughtered. His young son is driven out into the desert with almost nothing. And the men who did it, the cold emperor and the cruel baron, climb a little higher on the very power that destroying a better man has won them. A reader is meant to feel the unfairness of this in their chest. And the unfairness is the lesson. The world of Dune does not reward the good leader for being good. It treats his goodness as a weakness, a soft spot to be exploited, a danger to be removed. Meanwhile, it lifts up the schemer and the bully. Because the schemer and the bully are the ones built to thrive in a place where power is the only thing that counts. Herbert is showing, through the fall of one beloved family, the whole shape of his warning. The seat of power does not call out to the kind. It calls out to the grasping, and it punishes the gentle for getting in the way. There is a deeper turn of the screw here, and it reaches back to the boy at the center of the story. Paul, the young son who survives the slaughter, spends the whole book climbing toward power, gathering the desert people, growing stronger, aiming himself at revenge and at the throne. A reader follows that climb with hope. Yet the throne Paul is climbing toward is the same throne that just destroyed his good and gentle father. It is the same magnet, pulling at the same kind of person, set inside the same machine that rewards cruelty and crushes mercy. Even if Paul begins as the best person in the story, the chair he is fighting so hard to reach was built to ruin whoever sits in it. The seat does not care how the climber started out. It only cares about what it slowly does to them once they arrive. Herbert did not pull this idea out of thin air. He had spent years working as a newspaperman and watching how real power moved through real governments, and he came away convinced that the people who chase high office most hungrily are often the people least fit to hold it. The ones who would use power gently tend to hesitate, to doubt themselves, to step back. The ones who crave it never hesitate at all. So the race for the top is run mostly by the runners least troubled by where their feet land. And those are usually the ones who win. Over enough time, across enough handovers of power, the gentle keep dropping out, and the grasping keep being rewarded, until the whole machine is tilted, quietly, in favor of exactly the wrong people. What makes this so hard to fix is that it is nobody's single decision. No one sat down and chose to build a world where good leaders get killed for being loved. The tilt comes from the shape of the thing, from countless small choices adding up, from fear and ambition, and the simple math of who is willing to do what. A reader can remove the cruel baron from the story, and the problem would not go away, because the chair would simply pull in the next baron, and the one after that. The trouble is woven into the structure, and structures are far harder to hate than people, which is part of why they last so long. This is also why Herbert refused to let his readers off easy with a simple story of good against evil. Plenty of tales hand you a wicked villain to boo and a pure hero to cheer, and they let you walk away, believing that if only the bad person were removed, all would be well. Dune denies that comfort. The cruel baron is genuinely cruel, and the cold emperor is genuinely cold. Yet behind both of them stands the machine that made room for them and will make room for others. Removing the villain does not heal the machine. The machine goes on, humming quietly, drawing the next hungry hand toward the seat. When the two ideas from these first stretches of thought are set side by side, the full warning starts to take shape. On one side, ordinary people keep handing their trust to a single shining leader and refusing to take it back. On the other side, the seat that leader climbs into keeps filling with exactly the people who should never be trusted with that much power. Put those two halves together, and the danger doubles. The crowd offers up all of its judgment to one person, and the system has already arranged for that person to be, more often than not, the worst possible choice. The trust flows in one direction. The kind of soul it flows toward is bent in the other. Herbert offers no easy escape from this, and that honesty is part of why his book still unsettles people decades later. He does not promise that the right voting, or the right rules, or the right good-hearted candidate will set everything straight. Because his whole point is that the structure itself keeps bending things crooked, no matter who steps up. The best he offers is the same small, hard piece of advice from before. Keep some of your own judgment back. Do not pour all of your trust into one seat, no matter who is sitting in it. Because the seat has a long history of corrupting the view from up there, and of attracting the people most willing to misuse the height. Seen this way, the destruction of the good Duke at the start of Dune is more than a sad event that gets the plot moving. It is a small, clear model of the entire warning, played out in a single family. A good man rules well and is loved, and for that, he is marked and destroyed by the powers above him, who fear nothing so much as goodness that the people might rally behind. His son survives and turns toward the same throne, carrying the reader's hope with him, climbing toward a seat that has just shown, in blood, what it does to the decent. The magnet pulls, the machine hums. And the question of whether anyone, even a good and gifted boy, can sit in that chair without being slowly twisted by it, hangs over everything that follows. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The strangest part of all, though, is still ahead. The seat of power in Dune does more than simply attract the wrong people and wait for them to arrive. In some corners of this world, the powerful do not leave their rise to chance at all. They reach back across hundreds of years and plant the seeds of belief in the minds of whole peoples, growing a faith in advance so that when the right moment comes, a leader can step forward and be worshipped as something holy, exactly on schedule. To understand how Paul becomes a god to the desert people, the next thing to look at is the quiet, patient work that was done long before he was ever born. Section 3. The faith that was planted. The most patient kind of power in Dune does not wait around to be noticed. It works in the dark, long before anyone is alive to see it, planting ideas in the minds of whole peoples the way a farmer plants seeds in a field he will never live to harvest. To understand how a single boy could walk into a desert full of strangers and be greeted almost at once as a holy savior sent to free them, a person has to look back hundreds of years before that boy was born, at the quiet work of an order of women who understood belief better than anyone else in their world. These women were called the Bene Gesserit, and across the rest of this story, it is simpler to think of them as the sisterhood. For thousands of years, they had trained their members in skills that looked, to outsiders, almost magical. They could read the smallest movements of a face and know when someone was lying. They could control their own bodies down to the smallest detail. They could shape their voices in a way that bent the will of the person listening. And while emperors rose and fell, and great families burned one another to the ground, the sisterhood quietly moved among all of them, whispering, marrying into bloodlines, steering the future from the shadows with a patience no single ruler could ever match. One of their oldest and most cunning tools had to do with religion. The sisterhood had learned, over many lifetimes, that people everywhere carry a deep hunger to believe in something larger than themselves, and that this hunger can be used. So they built a long, careful program of planting beliefs on faraway worlds. They would send their members out to distant, simple places and seed those places with myths and old promises and holy stories, none of which were true, all of which were designed to take root and grow over the centuries into a full and trusted faith. The reason behind this was coldly practical. If a member of the sisterhood ever found herself stranded on a strange and dangerous world, she could reach into that planted faith, present herself as a figure the old stories had foretold, and the frightened locals would protect her, feed her, and obey her, believing they were serving something holy. The faith was a kind of insurance, buried in the minds of strangers generations in advance, waiting to be claimed. The people who carried it had no idea they were carrying a tool made by someone else for someone else's use. Herbert gave this idea a chilling clarity in one of his later books, where the sisterhood spells out their own thinking about persuasion. The goal of an argument, in their eyes, was never simply to win a point or share an honest thought. The goal was to change what people accept as true, to reach into a mind and reshape the ground it stands on. Truth, for the sisterhood, was something to be built and rebuilt to fit their needs. And a planted faith was their grandest building of all. The desert planet at the heart of the story had been seeded this way long ago. Out among its dunes lived the Fremen, a hard and proud people who had survived in one of the cruelest places imaginable. And into their beliefs, the sisterhood had quietly planted a promise. Someday, the old stories told them, a voice would come from another world, an outsider born of one of their own mothers. And this person would carry strange knowledge and stranger power, and would lead the desert people out of their suffering and turn their dry world green. The Fremen had held that promise close for generations, passing it from parent to child, waiting for the one who would come. They did not know that the promise had been written for them, on purpose, by hands that did not care about them at all. Into that waiting belief walked Paul and his mother. After their family was destroyed and they fled into the open sand with nothing, Paul and his mother Jessica were taken in by a band of these desert people, and the legend began to stir the moment the Fremen looked at them. Here was an outsider, born of his mother, arriving in their midst with uncanny knowledge and a presence that unsettled them. The shape of the old promise and the shape of the boy in front of them seemed to match, and the Fremen began, cautiously at first, to wonder whether the one they had waited for had finally come. What makes this scene so unsettling, once a person sees it clearly, is that Jessica knew exactly what was happening, because Jessica was one of the sisterhood herself. She had been trained in the very program that planted the desert legend, and she recognized its fingerprints the instant she heard the Fremen speak of their promised one. She understood that the holy story now circling her son was a thing her own order had buried here ages ago. And rather than gently correct the desert people, she did the opposite. She leaned into the legend. She used her training to play the role the planted faith expected, shaping how the Fremen saw her and her boy, feeding the belief, because that belief was the one thing standing between the two of them and death in a place where outsiders did not survive. So the holy welcome Paul received was real in the hearts of the Fremen and hollow at its root. The desert people truly believed they were looking at a savior promised by the deepest stories of their faith. Paul and his mother were quietly stepping into a costume that had been sewn for them by strangers centuries before, using the kindness and devotion of a trusting people as a shield. What looked from the outside like destiny unfolding exactly as the old stories said, was the slow payoff of a lie planted long ago and watered by hope. Herbert is doing something careful and brave here. and it cuts against the grain of almost every savior story ever told. In the usual tale, a prophecy comes true, and the reader feels a thrill, because a deep promise written into the bones of the world has finally been kept. Dune shows the strings. It shows that the promise had an author, that the author had selfish reasons, and that the people who treasured the promise were being used by it the whole time. The miracle of the chosen one arriving at last is revealed as a piece of long planning, a trap of belief sprung exactly as designed, dressed up as the hand of heaven. The deeper lesson sits just beneath that reveal. A planted faith works only because the people who carry it want so badly for it to be true. The sisterhood did not force the Fremen to believe anything. They simply offered a story, shaped to fit a hunger the desert people already had. The hunger for rescue, for meaning, for someone stronger to come and lift the weight off their shoulders. The seed was theirs, but the hunger was the Fremen's own. And without that hunger, the seed would have withered. This is why the trick is so hard to guard against. The thing being used against a people is the most human and tender thing about them: their longing to be saved. That longing connects straight back to the warning at the start of all this. The greatest danger was never the wicked enemy. The greatest danger lives in the warm willingness of ordinary people to hand their judgment to someone wonderful and stop asking hard questions. A planted faith is that willingness turned into a weapon. It does not have to argue anyone into trusting blindly, because it reaches people in childhood, woven into the stories they are raised on, so that by the time the false savior arrives, the trust is already there, deep and unquestioned, feeling for all the world like their own free choice. A person who has been handed a faith and never once asked who made it has already given away the very judgment Herbert begged them to keep. There is a second strand to the sisterhood's long game, and it threads through everything. For many generations, they had also been quietly guiding marriages between powerful families, steering bloodlines across the centuries toward the birth of one special person, a man they hoped would carry abilities no one had ever held before. The planted faiths on all those distant worlds were partly meant to prepare the ground for this person, so that when at last he was born, peoples everywhere would already be primed to receive him as something holy. Paul was tangled up in this plan, born close to the design the sisterhood had aimed at for so long, arriving a little early and a little off their careful schedule. The promise waiting in the desert was, in part, a promise the sisterhood had laid down for their own coming creation, only for events to slip out of their hands. And that slipping is the heart of the danger. The sisterhood believed they were the clever ones, the patient gardeners shaping belief across the ages, always in control of the faiths they planted. What they had truly done was light a fire in the minds of millions and assume they could decide forever where it would burn. A planted faith, once it takes hold of a desperate people and joins with a living leader who seems to fulfill it, stops belonging to its makers. It becomes a force of its own, with a hunger and a momentum the planners never accounted for. The gardeners had grown something far larger and far hotter than they understood. And a thing that large does not stay obedient to the hands that planted it. When this is set beside the earlier pieces, the warning grows another layer. People hand their trust to a shining leader. The seat that leader climbs into is built to attract the worst sort of hand. And beneath both of those, quietly, the powers behind the scenes have spent centuries planting the very beliefs that make the worship possible, shaping faith into a tool of control, while the faithful never suspect a thing. Paul does not simply wander into glory. He walks into a role that was written, staged, and waiting, with an audience already trained to fall to its knees. Yet the makers of the legend were about to learn something they had never planned for. And it is the thing that turns this whole story from a tale of clever manipulation into a tragedy no one can stop. A planted seed is only half of what grows a savior. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The other half comes from the crowd itself, from millions of frightened and hopeful people who take that small planted seed and pour their own longing into it, until it swells into something monstrous. Something that will sweep across the stars and burn whole worlds in the name of the gentle boy they chose to worship. How the desert people took Paul and built him, with their own hands and their own desperate faith, into a God far larger and far more dangerous than anyone intended, is where this story turns next. Section 4. The crowd that builds its king. A planted seed of belief is only the smaller half of what makes a savior. The larger half, the part that turns a single person into a force that can shake the stars, comes from the crowd itself. Frank Herbert understood something about worship that most hero stories quietly ignore. A god is not born, and a god does not simply arrive. A god is built, slowly and lovingly, by the very people who kneel before him. And once they have built him, he belongs to them far more than they belong to him. Buried in the pages of Dune is a short, strange warning spoken by one of the few clear-eyed people in the story. A quiet man who has spent his life studying the desert planet and the people who live on it. He says that no greater disaster could ever fall upon a people than for them to fall into the hands of a hero. The line lands oddly in the middle of a tale that looks, on its surface, like a hero rising to set the world right. Yet it is the truest sentence in the book, and the whole second half of the story is built to prove it. The disaster the man warns about is not a hero who turns wicked. The disaster is what a desperate people do when they finally get a hero to follow. Herbert spelled out his thinking inside the book in plainer terms still. The greatness of a beloved leader, he wrote, depends in large part on the imagination of the people who follow him. A person becomes great mostly because the admiring crowd has decided to imagine them as great, and then treats that imagining as solid fact. The hero and the worshippers make each other. The leader supplies a face and a few real deeds, and the crowd pours into that face all of its hopes and fears and dreams of rescue, until the figure standing before them has swollen far beyond any actual man. The savior, in the end, is a thing the people create together, with the leader as only a part of the making. This is exactly what happens to Paul among the desert people. They had been handed the planted promise of a savior long ago, and now here was a boy who seemed to fit it, and so they began to build. Each small sign they read into him made them believe a little harder. Each thing they believed made them treat him with a little more awe, and the more awe they showed, the larger he loomed in their own minds, until the grieving boy who had stumbled into their world half dead was no longer a boy to them at all. They gave him a new name and spoke it like a prayer. They began to see in him the answer to every hardship they had ever suffered. Paul could feel it happening, and he was afraid of it. This is the part that separates Dune from the ordinary tale of a chosen one. The boy at the center of the worship does not want it, at least not at first, because he can see where it leads. Through his growing visions, he glimpses a future in which his name becomes a banner. And behind that banner, the desert people pour off their dry world and across the whole galaxy, carrying a holy war from one end of the stars to the other. He sees the fires. He sees the slaughter. He calls this looming horror a terrible purpose, and he spends much of the story trying to find some path, any path, that might let him climb to power and take his revenge without unleashing it. He looks down every road his sight can show him, hunting for the one that avoids the flood, and he cannot find it. The crowd has already started building, and a built god cannot simply step down and ask everyone to go home. The worship has its own weight now, its own pull, its own momentum, and that momentum is bigger than the wishes of the man at its center. The desert people do not love Paul because of careful thought. They love him out of a deep and ancient hunger that the planted promise woke in them. And a hunger that large does not listen to reason. It wants its Savior, and it wants the salvation it was promised. And it will carry both outward into the universe, whether the Savior wishes it or not. By the time Paul wins his great victory and takes the throne, the thing he feared has already slipped out of his hands. His followers spill across the galaxy in his name, certain they are doing holy work, certain that every world they conquer and every life they take is a step toward the paradise their Savior was sent to bring. They are not following his orders so much as following the idea of him, the towering, God-shaped figure they built together out of the planted promise and their own longing. He is their reason and their banner, and they no longer need him to actually command anything. The figure they made has come alive and started walking on its own. More than 60 billion people die in the holy war waged in Paul's name. Whole worlds are scoured of life. Faiths are wiped out, cities are emptied, and the number of the dead climbs to a height the human mind can barely hold. The gentle boy that readers and desert people alike fell in love with sits at the center of the largest slaughter the galaxy has ever known. And the cruelest part is that he saw it coming from far off and still could not turn it aside. The crowd built him too well. They made him into something they could no longer stop. And then they used what they had made to drown the stars in blood. All of it done out of love and devotion and the joyful certainty that they were saving the world. What Herbert is showing through all of this is that worship is not a gentle thing, even when it feels gentle from the inside. A crowd that has decided to adore a leader gives away far more than its respect. It gives away its judgment, its caution, its willingness to question. And in return, it receives the warm thrill of certainty, the comfort of believing that someone wonderful is in charge and that everything will be made right. That trade feels good. It feels like faith and hope and belonging. And it is the most dangerous trade a people can make. Because a crowd that has switched off its own thinking will follow its built God straight into horror and call the horror holy the entire way. The man at the center is trapped just as surely as the crowd is. Once the people have made Paul their God, he loses the freedom to be an ordinary person who changes his mind. He cannot say he was wrong. He cannot admit doubt. He cannot step off the path because millions of lives now hang on his every word and gesture, and the smallest sign of weakness from a God could shatter the faith holding the whole structure together. The worship that lifts him up also locks him in place. He becomes a prisoner of the very devotion that crowns him, forced to keep playing a role he never truly wanted, watching the war spread and knowing his own name is the fuel that feeds it. This connects straight back to the warning Herbert kept repeating from the very beginning. He had said that the mistakes of a single leader grow larger with every follower who obeys without question, until one person's error becomes a disaster that swallows millions. The Holy War in Dune is that idea made real and pushed to its furthest edge. Paul is one man, and one man can only do so much harm on his own. But Paul, multiplied by countless worshippers who will do anything in his name, becomes a catastrophe on a scale no single person should ever be able to reach. The crowd is the multiplier. The crowd is what turns a man's shadow into a galaxy-wide night. Herbert was so worried that readers would miss this that he refused to end the tale on Paul's victory. The first book closes with Paul on the throne, his enemies broken, and a reader could easily shut it there and feel the old warm satisfaction of a hero who has won. So Herbert wrote on. He followed Paul past the triumph and into the wreckage, into a galaxy still smoldering from the Holy War, into the hollow life of a man worshipped as a god and loved by billions, and yet utterly alone. He wanted the reader to sit in the ashes of the victory they had cheered for and feel the true cost of it. To understand at last that the cheering had been the problem all along. The desert people are not villains in any of this, and that is what makes it so hard to look at. They are a brave, suffering people who only wanted to be free and to see their dying world bloom. Their devotion is real and their hopes are good. They were handed a promise built to use them, and they took that promise and filled it with everything decent and desperate in their hearts. And out of all that goodness and longing, they helped build a force that burned the stars. Herbert is not asking anyone to despise them. He is asking everyone to recognize the same hunger in themselves, the hunger to be saved, and to see how easily that beautiful hunger can be turned into a weapon by anyone or anything that arrives wearing the right face at the right time. So the Savior in Dune has two makers, and neither of them is heaven. The first maker is the hidden power that planted the promise centuries in advance. The second maker is the crowd that took the promise and grew it, with their own hands and their own faith, into a God far larger and far more terrible than the planters ever planned for. Paul stands at the meeting point of those two forces, lifted up by a lie he did not write and a love he cannot refuse, carried toward a horror he can see and cannot stop. He is the most powerful person in the universe, and he is helpless, because the thing the crowd built is bigger than the man inside it. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. One question hangs over the whole tragedy, though, and it sharpens everything that has come before. Paul saw the Holy War coming. Long before the First World burned, he watched it unfold in his mind, again and again, in visions that showed him the rivers of dead stretching out across the years. He could see the future itself, clearly and in terrible detail. And the strangest, saddest truth of his whole story is that this gift, the very power that should have let him steer clear of disaster, turned out to be the cage that trapped him most tightly of all. How seeing everything that was coming became Paul's prison rather than his escape is the next turn this story has to take. Section 5. The weight of seeing everything. The single power that should have saved Paul from disaster turned out to be the thing that trapped him most completely. He could see the future, not in the vague way of a fortune teller squinting at clouds, but truly, in sharp and living detail, watching the days and years ahead unfold inside his mind as clearly as a person watches the road in front of them. It is the kind of gift that sounds, at first, like the greatest power anyone could hold. To know what is coming is to be ready for anything, to dodge every trap, to choose perfectly every time. That is how it seems from the outside. Frank Herbert spent 2 whole books showing that the truth is almost the exact opposite, and that a person who can see everything that is coming is, in the end, the least free person alive. Paul's sight grew slowly. As a boy, he had strange dreams that sometimes came true, small flickers of things before they happened. After his family fell and he went to live among the desert people, the spice that soaked everything on that dry world began to change him from the inside. The spice was in their food and their air and their water, and over time it sharpened his mind and woke the gift sleeping in his blood until the flickers became floods. By the time he drank a dangerous, sacred liquid that the desert people used in their holiest ceremony, a substance so poisonous it killed most who touched it, the gates inside him broke fully open, and the future poured in. What he saw was not a single road stretching ahead. He saw thousands of roads at once, branching and splitting and tangling together, every possible thing that might happen laid out before him like a vast and shifting map. Each choice he might make sent the future spinning down a different path, and he could follow each of those paths with his mind and watch where they led. He could look down one road and see triumph, down another and see ruin, down a third and see something stranger still. No person had ever held a sight like it, and the sisterhood, who had bred towards such a being for so long, had never quite understood what it would do to the one who finally carried it. Here is where the gift began to close around him like a trap. To see a future is one thing. To live knowing you have seen it is another, far heavier thing. Once Paul had looked down a road and watched where it led. That road was no longer a free and open choice. It became a thing he already knew, a future he was now bound to walk toward or away from, with every step weighed down by the knowing. A person without his sight stumbles forward into a dark that hides their mistakes and their chances alike. And that darkness, for all its fear, is a kind of freedom. Paul lost that darkness. He could never again take a step without already having seen where it landed. And a life with no surprises left in it is a life with no real choices left in it either. The Holy War was the clearest and cruelest example. Long before the First World burned, Paul had seen it coming. Watched the rivers of the dead stretch out across the years in vision after vision. He hunted through all those branching roads for one that might let him take his revenge and his throne without unleashing the slaughter. And he searched with the desperation of a man who has already watched the horror 100 times in his mind. The more clearly he looked, the more he understood that almost every road led to the fire, and that the few that did not led somewhere worse. His sight did not hand him an escape. It handed him the certain knowledge that there was no good way out, and then forced him to keep walking anyway. This is the strange and terrible shape of the trap. The clearer Paul's vision became, the more the future seemed to harden around him, like wet sand drying into stone. A blurry future has give in it, room to bend and change. A future seen in perfect detail has no give at all, because to see a thing perfectly is to fix it in place, to commit to it, to make it real before it has even happened. So the very sharpness that made his gift so powerful was also what made his life a prison, since each thing he saw with full clarity became a thing he could no longer truly change. He had traded the freedom of not knowing for the chains of knowing too much. Herbert pushed this idea into one of the eeriest pictures in all of his work. In the second book, after Paul has been emperor for years, an enemy attacks him with a weapon that destroys his eyes and leaves him blind. A blind emperor should be a helpless one, unable to read a room or cross it. Paul was not helpless. And the reason is deeply unsettling. His visions had shown him these exact moments so completely, so many times over, that he had every gesture and every step already memorized. He walked through his palace, turned at the right corners, reached out and picked up objects, looked people in the eye when he spoke to them. All of it perfectly. All of it without a working eye in his head. He was not seeing the world in front of him. He was moving through a future he had watched in his mind long ago, acting out a play he had already read to the end. That picture holds the whole lesson in a single image. A blind man walks across a room with perfect confidence because he has memorized every step in advance. And for as long as the world matches what he memorized, he seems to see better than anyone. The instant the world does something he did not foresee, though, he is helpless. More helpless than an ordinary blind man, because he has been trusting a map instead of his own senses. Paul lived this way for years, walking a future he had already seen. And every moment of his strange certainty was also a moment of his deepest captivity. He could not look away from the road, because the road was the only thing he could see at all. The cost of this went far beyond getting around a palace. A man who knows exactly what is coming cannot be surprised by joy, cannot be lifted by hope, cannot feel the simple human comfort of not knowing how things will turn out. Paul watched the people he loved move toward their fates, while he sat, already knowing the ending. He knew when sorrow was coming and could only wait for it to arrive on schedule, like a guest he had been forced to invite. The small mercy that lets ordinary people live, the mercy of an unwritten tomorrow, was taken from him. He carried the whole weight of every coming day before any of those days had even begun. And a person can only carry that weight for so long before it crushes something inside them. Herbert built Paul's gift this way on purpose, to argue something he believed about power and certainty in the real world. People long to know the future. They reach for anything that promises to take away the fear of not knowing. Whether it is a prophet, a plan, a chart, or a leader who speaks with total confidence about what tomorrow holds. That longing feels like a hunger for safety. Herbert saw it as a hunger that hands away your freedom, because the moment you accept that the future is already fixed and known, you stop believing your own choices matter. And a person who stops believing their choices matter becomes easy to lead and easy to use. Certainty, in his eyes, is a cage that people walk into willingly because the cage feels so much warmer than the open dark. The trap had another layer that made it tighter still. As emperor and as a living god, Paul was watched by billions who treated his every word as holy truth. They believed he could see all things and knew all ends. And that belief locked him even further into the role of the all-seeing one. He could not admit doubt, could not say he had been wrong about a vision, could not step off the path his own followers expected him to walk, because the faith of billions rested on the idea that he always knew the way. His sight had made him a prisoner of the future, and his worshippers had made him a prisoner of his own image, and the two prisons fed each other. The more they believed he saw everything, the less he was allowed to do anything but follow what he had seen. A reader might expect that such a powerful man could simply use his gift to make the world better, to steer history wisely with all that knowing. Paul tried, and the trying only deepened the tragedy. Each time he used his sight to nudge events toward a kinder ending, he discovered that the nudging had costs he had also foreseen. Ripples that spread out and caused new harm down roads he had already walked in his mind. He came to understand that a man holding the future in his hands is not a wise gardener tending a garden. He is a man holding something far too large for any single pair of hands, watching his smallest movements grow into avalanches, unable to set the thing down and unable to hold it safely either. By the end of his story, Paul did the only free thing left to him, and it cost him everything. He chose to stop. He chose to step off the path his visions had laid out, to give up the throne and the role and the endless seeing, even though stepping off the path meant walking, blind and alone, into the open desert to die in the way of the desert people. That walk into the sand was the first truly unforeseen step he had taken in years, the first moment in a long time that he did not already know the ending of. Giving up all that power and all that sight was, strangely, the only way he could ever be free again. He had to lose the future to get his life back, even if getting it back lasted only as long as the walk. When this is set beside everything that came before, the picture of power in Dune turns almost upside down. The crowds imagine that the man who sees everything and rules everything must be the freest and luckiest soul alive, the one person who has escaped all the fear and uncertainty that haunt the rest of them. Herbert shows the truth hiding underneath. The man at the very top, the one with the most sight and the most power, is the most trapped person in the entire story. He cannot doubt. He cannot rest. He cannot be surprised. He cannot change his mind or step aside or simply be ordinary, because too much now hangs on him, and his own clear vision of tomorrow has walled him in on every side. The height that everyone envies is a prison with the finest view in the universe. That idea reaches back and touches the warning at the heart of all of this. People hand their judgment to a leader, partly because they imagine that the leader knows what they do not, that he can see the road ahead while they stumble in the dark. Dune answers that comfort with a hard truth. Even a leader who truly can see the road ahead is not saved by it. He is bound by it, broken by it, carried helplessly down it by the weight of his own knowing and the weight of all the people leaning on him. There is no seat so high, no sight so clear that it lifts a person out of the human trap. The all-seeing God-Emperor and the blind beggar in the desert are, in the end, both just people, both fenced in by forces larger than themselves, and the only real difference is that the beggar still has the mercy of not knowing what tomorrow holds. Herbert refused to pretend any of this away. He did not give Paul a clever trick to slip the trap, did not let the gift of sight finally pay off in some great act of rescue. He let it stay a prison to the bitter end, because the prison was the point. The lesson was never that Paul used his power badly and a wiser man would have done better. The lesson was that the power itself, the seeing and the ruling and the carrying of the future, is a thing no person can hold without being slowly destroyed by it, no matter how good or gifted they happen to be. The chair ruins whoever sits in it, and the gift cages whoever holds it, and the worship traps whoever receives it. And there is no version of the story where one special soul finally beats the game. And yet, somewhere in all those thousands of branching roads, Paul had glimpsed one narrow path that led somewhere other than ruin. Far down that single thread, past horrors that dwarfed even the Holy War, he had seen a way for the whole human race to survive a doom that was creeping toward it from the distant future. A doom most people could not even imagine. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The path existed. He had seen it. But walking it would have meant doing something so monstrous, becoming something so far beyond human, that Paul looked down that road and turned away in horror, unwilling to pay a price that terrible even to save everyone. His refusal did not make the doom go away. It only left the burden lying in the sand, waiting for someone else to pick it up. Someone willing to become the very monster Paul could not bear to be. Who finally chose to walk that unbearable path, and what it cost him to do it, is where this story turns next. Section 6. The Tyrant Who Chose to Be Hated. The burden Paul could not carry did not vanish when he walked into the desert. It lay there in the sand, waiting. And the one who finally picked it up was his own son. The boy's name was Leto, and from the very moment of his birth, he was unlike any child the universe had ever produced. Because of the spice that had soaked into his family for so long, Leto was born already awake inside, already holding within him the memories and voices of countless people who had lived and died before him. A whole crowd of ancestors murmuring in his mind. He came into the world as an infant in body and an ancient in soul. And along with all that borrowed memory, he carried his father's terrible gift, the power to see the roads of the future stretching out ahead. So Leto could see what Paul had seen. He could look down those thousands of branching paths and watch where each one led. And like his father before him, he found that almost every road ended in ruin. Far in the distance, past wars and famines and the slow rot of a people who had grown too comfortable and too dependent, he saw the human race dwindling and dying out, hunted toward extinction by forces it had not yet even imagined. He saw that humanity, left to drift the way it was drifting, would not survive the long centuries ahead. And he saw the single narrow path that led somewhere other than the grave, the one thread of hope his father had also glimpsed and then turned away from in horror. The reason Paul turned away was simple and human. To walk that path, a person would have to give up being a person at all. They would have to surrender their body, their face, their place among other people, their hope of love, even their humanity itself, and become something monstrous and lonely beyond any words. They would have to rule the entire human race as a cruel and crushing tyrant for thousands of years, hated by everyone, cursed by every child, all while knowing that the hatred was the whole point. Paul had looked at that price and decided he could not pay it, even to save everyone. He chose to keep his soul and lose the future. His son chose the opposite. Leto looked at the same monstrous bargain and said yes. What he did to himself is one of the strangest and most haunting things in all of these books. Out in the deep desert lived small, simple creatures that, over long ages, grew into the giant worms that ruled the sand. Leto took these little creatures and let them cover his young body, joining himself to them, beginning a slow change that would last for centuries. Over time, his skin became something tougher than skin. His body stretched and thickened and stopped being human in shape, and he grew stronger and harder to kill than any person had ever been. The change gave him the strength of the great worms and a life that would stretch across thousands of years. It also slowly stole his human body from him, inch by inch, year by year, until the boy was gone and only the long, strange, half-worm ruler remained. With that power, he seized the entire human race in his fist and held it there for more than 3,000 years. People came to call him the Tyrant, and the name was earned. He crushed every rebellion. He forced a heavy, suffocating peace upon all the worlds, a peace with no freedom in it, a peace that felt to those living under it like a slow smothering. He controlled where people could go and what they could do. He kept the whole of humanity penned in and frustrated and starved for the open sky, generation after generation, century after century. a prison that lasted longer than most people's remembered any other way of living. A reader meeting the tyrant for the first time would see only a monster, and they would be right to. He was a monster. He did terrible things and made billions of lives smaller and grayer than they needed to be. But Herbert, who never let his readers rest easy with a simple villain, slowly reveals the awful purpose behind the cruelty. And the purpose turns the monster into one of the most tragic figures he ever wrote. Leto was not crushing humanity for pleasure, or for greed, or for the ordinary hunger for power that fills the wrong sort of ruler. He was crushing humanity in order to save it, by teaching it a lesson so deep and so painful that it would never, ever forget. The lesson was about the very thing this whole story has been circling from the start. Humanity, Leto saw, had a fatal weakness. It kept handing itself over to single, all-powerful leaders, kept longing to be saved by one great figure, kept switching off its own judgment and curling up safe under the rule of a god. That weakness had nearly destroyed it through Paul's holy war, and it would destroy it for good somewhere down the road. Leto decided that the only way to cure a people of their hunger for a god-king was to give them the worst god-king imaginable, and to keep him on the throne so long and make his rule so heavy and so airless that the hunger would finally die. He would be the tyrant that turned humanity against tyrants forever. He thought of it as a lesson written into the body of the whole species, not just into its books. Thousands of years of being penned in by one unbending ruler would build up in every human heart a pressure of longing for freedom so enormous that nothing could contain it. People would come to hate the very idea of a single hand holding all the power. They would ache for the open sky with their whole being. And when at last the tyrant died and the fist opened, that pressure would explode outward, flinging humanity across the stars in every direction, scattering it so far and so wide and into so many strange new forms that no single power could ever again gather it up, control it, or wipe it out. A people spread that thinly and grown that wild could never be hunted to extinction, because there would be no center left to strike, no throne left to seize, no one place where all the eggs were kept. Leto did one more thing to make sure of this, and it reaches back to the trap his father suffered. He spent his long centuries carefully guiding the births of one family line toward a special descendant, a woman whose blood carried a hidden change. That change made her, and all who came after her, invisible to the kind of future sight that had caged Paul, and that Leto himself possessed. No one with that gift could see her coming, could find her, or could control her. By weaving that invisibility into humanity, Leto made certain that never again could any all-seeing ruler, or any all-seeing hunting machine of the far future, track down every last human and snuff them out. He was building, on purpose, a humanity that could hide from gods, including from beings like himself. The loneliness of all this is almost too much to sit with. Leto remembered being human. He carried the memories of his gentle father and his loving mother, and inside him still lived the soft, ordinary wishes of a person. The wish to be touched, to be understood, to walk beside someone as an equal. Late in his long life, he even came to love a woman, deeply and truly, and the love only sharpened the horror of what he had become. Because his strange, half-worm body could never meet her as a man. He could feel tenderness and could not live it. He could remember being a person and could never be one again. Herbert makes a point of showing that the tyrant was not a creature who had forgotten kindness. He was a creature who remembered kindness perfectly and chose the monstrous path anyway, every single day, for thousands of years. That is what makes him so much harder to look at than any ordinary villain. A monster who has forgotten love is frightening. A monster who remembers it and sacrifices it on purpose is something closer to unbearable. The most chilling and tender truth of his whole reign is that he planned his own ending from the very beginning. He knew that the lesson only worked if it ended, that the pressure he was building only freed humanity once the fist opened, and the fist could only open if he died. So Leto arranged, across centuries, the circumstances of his own fall. He guided events so that the very people who hated him most, including the invisible woman he had bred for that purpose, would rise up and bring him down. When the moment came at last, and he tumbled from a high place into rushing water, his long body breaking apart, he met it as the final, planned step of his work. His death was not a defeat. It was the last gift he gave, the opening of the cage he had built and carried for so long, the release he had been working toward since the day he first let the little desert creatures cover his skin. And when he died, it happened just as he had foreseen. Humanity, freed at last from the longest and heaviest tyranny it had ever known, burst outward into the dark in a great scattering, flowing into the far reaches of the universe in numbers and forms beyond counting. They went so far and grew so different and so wild that no single power could ever hope to hold them all again. The lesson had been burned so deep that the very memory of the tyrant became a kind of warning carried in the blood, a horror of ever again kneeling to one being who held all the power. Leto had made himself the most hated name in human history, precisely so that the hatred would protect his people forever. He had become the worst tyrant who ever lived in order to cure his species of tyrants for all time. This is the furthest, darkest point of Herbert's whole argument about power, and it is worth sitting with quietly. From the very first warning, the lesson has been, beware of handing yourself over to a single great leader. The tyrant is that lesson taken to its most extreme and terrible conclusion. Herbert is saying that the human hunger to be ruled by a god is so deep, so stubborn, so woven into people, that nothing gentle could ever cure it. A speech could not cure it. A wise and kindly ruler could not cure it, since a kindly ruler only feeds the hunger by making the rule feel safe. The only thing strong enough to break humanity of its love affair with god-kings was thousands of years of suffering under the worst god-king of all, until the love finally curdled into a hatred that would last forever. There is something almost too neat and too horrible in that idea, and Herbert knew it. He did not present the tyrant as the hero who finally got it right, the wise exception who proves that the perfect ruler could exist after all. He presented Leto as a being who had to destroy his own humanity and crush billions of lives across thousands of years just to undo the damage that the hunger for heroes had already done, and who counted his own monstrous reign a success only because it ended in his death and his people's escape. The cure was nearly as terrible as the disease. The point was never that tyranny is good. The point was that the longing to be ruled by a god is so dangerous that even the cure for it had to be a horror. When the tyrant is set beside everything that came before, the warning reaches its full and final weight. Crowds hand their judgment to a shining leader. The seat of power draws in the wrong sort of hand. Hidden powers plant the faiths that make the worship possible. The worshippers build their god larger than any man, and then cannot stop what they have built. The all-seeing ruler is trapped by his own sight. And at the far end of all of it stands Leto, who looked at this whole cursed machine clearly, understood that it would kill the human race, and chose to become a monster for 3,000 years to break the machine apart. His reign is the price humanity paid for never having learned the simpler lesson. He is the answer to a question no people should ever have to ask, which is how much suffering it takes to teach a species to keep its own judgment and never give it all away. Yet under every one of these thrones, under the sisterhood and the emperors and Paul, and even the long centuries of the tyrant, there had always been one quiet thing that made all of their power possible in the first place. It was not their armies. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. It was not their bloodlines or their visions or their planted faiths. It was a single, precious substance, found in only one place in all the universe, buried in the sand of one harsh and unforgiving world. Whoever controlled that one thing controlled the fate of everyone, and the tyrant ruled for as long as he did, in large part because he alone held its only source in his grip. The deepest root of power in this entire story was never a crown at all. It was who held the sand. And that is where this story turns next. Section 7. Whoever holds the sand. Beneath every throne in this story, beneath the sisterhood and the emperors and the God King who ruled for 3,000 years, there was always one quiet thing holding the whole structure up. Not an army, not a bloodline, not a vision of the future. A substance. A fine, rust-colored powder found in only one place in all the universe, buried in the sand of a single, harsh, and waterless world, and called simply the spice. Everything that looked like power in Dune was really just a hand reaching, in one way or another, toward control of that powder. Strip away the crowns and the prophecies and the worship, and what remains at the bottom of it all is a fight over who gets to hold the sand. The spice was the most precious thing that had ever existed, and the reason was that the entire human universe had come to depend on it for nearly everything that mattered. People who took it lived far longer than they otherwise would, and stayed healthy and sharp into great old age. It widened the mind and woke strange abilities in those who used enough of it, including the gift of seeing the future that trapped both Paul and his son. The sisterhood needed it for their deepest training, but the most important thing the spice did, the thing that made it not merely valuable, but absolutely necessary, was that it made travel between the stars possible at all. In this far future, the great ships that crossed the vast distances between worlds could not simply blunder through the dark, because a single wrong move across such enormous gaps would smash a ship and everyone in it. The ships needed special pilots whose minds had been opened by years of soaking in the spice, pilots who could see the safe path through the emptiness ahead and steer the ship along it without ever crashing. No spice meant no such pilots. No pilots meant no travel between the stars. And no travel between the stars meant that the whole sprawling human civilization, spread across thousands of worlds, would instantly fall apart into countless lonely islands, each one cut off from all the others, each one slowly starving or stagnating alone. The spice was the thread that held the entire human universe together, and the thread was spun in only one place. That single fact reshaped everything. Because the spice came from only one world, controlling that one world meant controlling the lifeblood of all the others. Whoever held the desert planet held a hand around the throat of every other ruler, every other people, every other power in existence. because they could choke off the one thing that everyone needed and no one could make for themselves. There is a famous saying, made popular by the first film built from the book, that whoever controls the spice controls the universe. The book itself never puts it in quite those words, yet it shows the idea to be true in a way even sharper and more frightening than the saying suggests. Power in this future was not really about who wore the crown. It was about who stood on the sand. This is why the harsh desert world, a place no one would ever choose to live, became the most fought-over prize in human history. Great families schemed and murdered for the right to rule it. The cruel family that held it before Paul's people, the Harkonnens, grew monstrously rich by squeezing every grain of spice they could from the sand and hoarding great stockpiles of it. And that hoarded wealth made them one of the mightiest powers anywhere. The emperor himself secretly arranged the slaughter of Paul's good father, partly to keep the flow of spice tilted the way he wanted it. All the blood spilled across the early part of the story, all the betrayal and the burning, comes down in the end to a struggle over who gets to control the one resource that everyone is hooked on. And hooked is the right word, because the spice held people in another, darker way. Once a person had taken enough of it for long enough, their body could no longer do without it. Stopping was not a simple choice anymore. To be cut off from the spice after years of use was to sicken and often to die. So the most powerful people in the universe, the rulers and the pilots and the sisterhood, were not only dependent on the spice for their travel and their wealth and their long lives. They were dependent on it the way a body becomes dependent on something it can no longer survive without. The whole ruling order of humanity was, in a real sense, addicted to the very thing it fought over, which meant that whoever controlled the supply controlled not just their wealth, but their bodies, their health, their very survival. Herbert built this dependence on purpose, and he built it to make a point about our own world. He drew the spice, in large part, from the way the modern world depends on oil. Look at the pieces, and the picture is hard to miss. A precious substance that powers everything, found in greatest plenty in one hot and sandy part of the world, controlled through a giant web of companies and powerful interests, fought over in wars dressed up as something nobler than greed, with whole nations made rich or ruined by who happens to sit on top of the supply. Herbert set his version of that story far in the future and out among the stars. But the bones of it came straight from the headlines of his own time. From a world that had organized itself around the desperate need for a resource it could not stop using and could not make it home. The wealth of the spice flowed through a single enormous company that nearly every powerful family owned a piece of. A kind of vast, shared treasure chest that tied all their fortunes together. Holding the desert world meant steering that treasure, deciding who grew richer and who grew poorer, gently turning the flow of the universe's money toward yourself and your friends. So control of the sand was not only control of travel and survival, it was control of money on a scale that could lift a family to greatness or crush it into nothing. And that meant the desert world was not merely a planet, it was the single lever that moved the entire human economy. And everyone with ambition was forever scheming to get a hand on it. This is what makes the climax of Paul's rise so clever and so chilling. When Paul finally faces the emperor and the hidden powers behind the throne, he does not win by having the biggest army or the strongest claim. He wins by understanding the deepest truth of his world, which is that the spice is everything, and the spice comes only from his desert. Paul holds up a threat that no ruler in history had ever been able to make. He swears that if they do not bow to him, he will destroy the spice. Not seize it, not hoard it, destroy it, utterly and forever. Kill the source of it in the sand so that no spice would ever flow again, anywhere. That threat brought the most powerful people in the universe to their knees in an instant. And the reason reveals the whole hidden machine of power. To destroy the spice would not only ruin Paul's enemies, it would end travel between the stars, shatter the civilization that connected all the worlds, kill the pilots and the sisterhood who could not live without their dose, and plunge all of humanity into a dark and broken age from which it might never recover. Everyone needed the spice so completely that the mere promise to destroy it was a knife held to the throat of the entire species. And Paul understood the strange law at the bottom of it all. The one who can destroy a thing completely is the one who truly controls it, far more than the one who merely owns it. Because the power to take something away forever is the deepest power there is over anything that everyone depends on. When the god King Leto ruled for his 3,000 years, this same truth sat underneath his throne the whole time. People often think of the tyrant as ruling through fear and through his monstrous, near unkillable body. And he did. But the quiet root of his grip on humanity was that he held the only source of the spice in his fist. And as long as he held it, every world and every people had to come to him, bend to him, obey him, because he could choke off the lifeblood of the universe whenever he chose. His tyranny was built on many things, yet the foundation stone of it was the sand. Control the one resource that everyone is hooked on, and you do not need to chase people down. They come to you, because they cannot live without what you alone can give. The lesson hidden in the spice reaches back and joins the warning that has run through everything. A people who become completely dependent on a single thing have, without ever deciding to, handed their freedom to whoever controls that thing. They may still imagine themselves free. They may still have their leaders and their laws and their proud talk of independence. But the moment their survival rests entirely on one resource, from one source, the holder of that source holds them, and all the crowns and speeches in the world cannot change it. Dependence is its own kind of surrender, slower and quieter than kneeling to a god king, but just as total in the end. The crowd hands away its judgment to a shining leader. A whole civilization can hand away its freedom to a substance and never notice the handing until someone threatens to take the substance away. Herbert was not only writing about the far future when he buried this idea in the sand. He was holding up a mirror to a world that had built its entire way of life on a single resource pulled from beneath the ground. A world that fought and bled and toppled governments over the flow of that resource. A world that could be brought to a standstill the moment the supply was choked. The spice is the dependence taken to its furthest point, the warning made enormous. But the shape of it is the shape of our own hunger. Any people that lets its survival rest on one precious thing has already given away more of its freedom than it knows, and put that freedom into the hands of whoever stands on the source. So the truest map of power in Dune is not a map of thrones or armies or family trees. It is a map of a single desert world and the precious dust beneath it. Every scheme, every betrayal, every holy war and every tyranny traces back, in the end, to that one stretch of sand, and the question of whose hand is closed around it. The crown is a decoration. The sand is the power. And the deepest lesson of it is that whoever controls the one thing everyone cannot live without does not need to ask for obedience, because dependence asks for them. There is one more truth folded into that desert, though, and it carries a warning of a different, and more uncomfortable kind. The spice came from the sand, but the only people who truly knew that sand, who could survive its killing heat and walk its dunes and even ride the great worms that made the spice, were the desert people themselves. The Fremen, who had lived there for countless generations. Every outside power craved their sand and grew rich off their world. And yet every outside power looked down on them as wild and backward, barely worth noticing. Into that gap, into the space between the precious sand and the scorned people who knew it best, stepped a stranger. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. An outsider from another world, born to a powerful family far away, who came to the desert, learned its ways, won the trust of its people, and rose to lead them as their savior and their war chief. It is a story that feels thrilling on the page. And it is a story Herbert borrowed, quite deliberately, from real and painful chapters of our own history. The tale of the stranger who comes from outside and becomes a god to a native people he was not born among is where this story turns next. Section 8. The Stranger Who Became a God. The story at the center of Dune is older than science fiction, older than most of the books in any library. And Frank Herbert knew exactly where he was getting it. A young man from a powerful, faraway people arrives in a harsh desert land. He is an outsider, raised in comfort and privilege, with nothing of the desert in his blood. Yet he learns the ways of the local people who have survived there for countless generations, earns their trust, takes up their fight against the cruel power that rules them, and rises to lead them. In time, they come to see him as more than a leader. They see him as a savior, a holy figure, almost a god. Paul Atreides walking among the desert people is that story. And it is a story Herbert lifted with open eyes from real and painful chapters of human history. About 100 years before Herbert wrote his book, there lived a soldier from one of the mightiest empires on earth who went into a vast desert during a great war. He came from outside, a stranger to the desert tribes, and yet he threw in his lot with them as they rose up against the foreign empire that had long ruled over them. He learned their language and wore their clothes, and rode with them across sands the enemy thought impossible to cross. He helped them strike fast and vanish, striking and slipping away into the dunes before the enemy could catch them. And by the end, he had become a near-legendary figure among those desert people, a foreign man wrapped in the robes of their world, half soldier and half myth. Anyone who knows that real man's story and then reads Dune feels a shiver of recognition, because Paul is built so closely on him that whole scenes and images seem to step straight out of the history and onto the page. Herbert drew from a second true story as well, an older one, about a proud mountain people in a distant land who fought for decades against a giant empire that was swallowing their homeland piece by piece. A writer had set down the tale of that long resistance, of the fierce desert and mountain fighters and their stubborn leader, and Herbert read it closely and borrowed from it freely. He took their words and dropped them into the mouths of his desert people. The name they use for a blood feud, the name of a curved fighting knife, even the secret tongue his desert people speak, all of these he carried over from that real account of a real people resisting a real empire. So when the Fremen of Dune fight against the cruel power trying to control their world, they are fighting a battle stitched together from true struggles of true peoples against the empires that came to take what their lands held. The desert people themselves, the Fremen, were shaped from real cultures too. Herbert built them out of the proud, hardy desert tribes of our own world. peoples who had learned to survive in places that would kill an unprepared traveler in a day, who carried a deep and austere faith, who valued discipline and water and honor in a land that offered little of any of them. He gave the Fremen a religion blended from several of the great faiths of Earth, and he filled their speech with words borrowed from the languages of those desert cultures. The Fremen are not a pure invention. They are a careful echo of real people, and that is part of why they feel so solid and so dignified on the page. And also part of why the story Herbert tells about them carries a sting. Here's the uncomfortable heart of it. The story of the gifted outsider who comes to a native people, learns their ways better than they know them, leads them to victory, and is worshipped as their savior, is a story that has been told over and over, and it has almost always been told from the outsider's side. It is a flattering story for the stranger. It says that the local people were waiting, helpless, for a better and brighter person to arrive from elsewhere and show them the way to their own freedom. It puts the foreigner at the center of a people's struggle and makes their liberation his triumph. And history is full of real cases where that very story was used to dress up something far uglier, where outsiders came to a land hungry for what it held, called the people there backward and in need of saving, and took control while calling it rescue. Herbert knew all of this, and he built Paul's Rise on that pattern on purpose, because he wanted to turn the flattering story inside out and show the danger hidden in it. On the surface, Paul among the Fremen reads like the grandest version of the savior tale. The desert people are oppressed by a monstrous foreign power that plunders their world for its riches. Paul, the noble outsider, joins them, learns their harsh and beautiful ways, proves himself again and again, and leads them in a glorious uprising that throws off their oppressors and wins them their freedom and their dream of a green world. A reader can be swept up in it completely, cheering as the scorned desert people finally rise and triumph behind their adopted champion. But Herbert never lets the triumph stay clean, and the dirt in it is the whole point. The very thing that makes Paul able to lead the Fremen is the planted faith that taught them to expect an outsider savior, the same buried lie examined earlier. Their devotion to him is not really a free choice. It is a trap set in their minds long ago, sprung the moment a suitable stranger arrived. And once Paul has their faith and their fearsome fighting skill in his hands, he uses them. He uses them for his family's revenge. He uses them to climb to the throne of the entire universe. The desert people who fought so bravely for their own freedom become, almost without noticing, the engine of one man's rise to absolute power. And then the soldiers of the holy war that pours off their world and drowns the stars in blood. They won their planet and lost themselves. Their faith became a weapon in a stranger's hand. Their courage became fuel for a slaughter. And the freedom they bled for curdled into an empire ruled by the very man they had worshipped. Even before Paul, the pattern was there in how every outside power treated the desert world. They came for one reason only, which was the precious spice buried in its sand. They cared nothing for the people who lived there, regarding them as wild savages, barely worth counting, obstacles to be cleared, or tools to be used in the harvesting of the riches everyone craved. The cruel power that ruled before Paul's family treated the Fremen as vermin to be hunted. Even Paul's own good and decent father, who hoped to work with the desert people rather than crush them, still came as an outside ruler, imposing his own order on their world, still saw them as useful allies in his own struggle, rather than as equals with their own path. The kindest outsiders in the story still arrived to govern a people who had never asked to be governed, on a world they had come to for its wealth. The whole history of the desert planet is a history of strangers coming to take what the sand held, while looking down on the people of the sand. This is where Herbert's deepest warning about heroes joins his portrait of how powerful peoples treat weaker ones. The outsider savior feels, from inside the story, like a gift to the native people, a champion who lifts them up. From a wider view, he is one more stranger who arrives, takes hold of a people's faith and their fighting strength, and bends both toward ends that serve his own rise. The Fremen do not end the story as masters of their own destiny. They end it as the worshippers of a god-emperor, their religion hardened into something rigid and grand, their warriors marching off to conquer worlds they had never heard of in the name of a man who was not born among them. The savior from outside did not set them free. He gathered up their devotion and their courage and spent both on a throne. There has long been an argument about whether Herbert pulled this off or fell into the very trap he meant to expose. Some readers, then and now, have seen Dune as just another telling of the flattering outsider tale, a story that still puts a privileged stranger at the heart of a native people's struggle, and lets him be the brightest and most important person in their world. It is a fair worry, because the savior story is seductive even when a writer means to criticize it. And plenty of readers walked away from the book loving Paul as exactly the kind of hero Herbert was trying to warn them against. The same warm feeling that fooled people into cheering the conqueror could fool them into cheering the outsider savior too. Yet everything Herbert built into the story, and everything he said about it afterward, points toward warning rather than worship. He wrote the bitter follow-up that showed the Holy War's true cost. He spoke again and again about the danger of handing a people's trust to a single shining figure. And he made sure that Paul's leadership of the desert people leads not to their flowering, but to their use. Their faith turned to a weapon, their freedom traded for a crown. Herbert took the most flattering story a powerful people tells about itself, the story of the gifted stranger who saves the grateful natives, and he ran it forward to its real and ugly end, where the saved people become the foot soldiers of the Savior's empire, and the riches of their world keep flowing outward, exactly as before. The lesson here braids together with all the others. A people who hand their judgment to an outsider savior are in even greater danger than a people who follow one of their own, because the outsider does not share their fate. He can use their faith and their blood, and then rise above them into a power that leaves them behind. The planted faith makes the worship possible. The hunger for rescue makes it eager. And the gifted stranger, however noble he believes himself to be, becomes one more hand reaching for the riches of a world that was never his, lifted up the whole way by the very people he will eventually rule. Beware of heroes, Herbert had said. Beware most of all, the story whispers, of the hero who comes from outside, speaking of your freedom while gathering your strength into his own hands. Herbert offered no comfortable way out of this, and that refusal is part of why the book has stayed so alive in arguments for 60 years. He did not give the Fremen a wiser path, did not let them throw off both the foreign empire and the foreign savior, and walk freely into a future of their own making. He let them win their world and lose their souls. Let their bravest dream become the seed of the largest slaughter in history. Because that, he believed, is what so often happens when a proud and suffering people pour all their hope into a champion who was not born among them, and does not, in the end, belong to them. The triumph is real. The The cost is hidden inside the triumph. And the cost is everything. So the thrilling tale of the stranger who became a god turns out to be one more chamber in Herbert's long warning about power. Every kind of power examined so far has been a power held over other people. Power over a trusting crowd. Power over a throne and the wrong hands it draws. Power over the faith of a planted people. Power over the one resource everyone needs. Power of an outsider over the natives whose strength he borrows. And every single one of them has led to ruin, to slaughter, to chains, or to a god-king trapped on his lonely throne. Each form of holding power over others has carried its own poison. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. And yet, threaded quietly through the whole story, almost hidden beneath the wars and the thrones, there is one kind of power that never enslaves anyone, never traps the holder, never burns a single world. It is the smallest kind and the hardest to win. And it was the first real strength Paul ever showed, long before he had armies or visions or a desert full of worshippers. It was something he learned from his mother in the quiet of his own mind, a way of mastering his own fear when terror should have broken him. That quiet power over oneself, the one form of strength in all of Dune that Herbert seems to truly admire rather than dread, is where this story turns next. Section 9. The only power worth keeping. Every kind of power that has come up so far has been a power held over other people. And every one of them has ended in ruin or in chains. There is one more kind, though, and it is the quietest and the smallest of them all. It does not command armies or topple thrones or set worlds on fire. It cannot be used to rule anyone. It is the power a person holds over their own fear and their own mind. And it is the one form of strength in all of Dune that Frank Herbert seems to truly respect rather than dread. It was also the very first real strength Paul ever showed, long before he had a single follower. In a small room with no audience but a stern old woman and a box that promised agony. The book opens, before any of the great events, with a test. An old woman of the sisterhood has come to examine the boy Paul, to find out what he truly is. She sets a plain box on the table in front of him and tells him to place his hand inside it. Then she holds a tiny poisoned needle close against the side of his neck, and she tells him the rule of the test. He must keep his hand in the box. If he pulls it out, the needle will touch his skin, and he will die. Inside the box, she warns him, he will feel pain. He does not yet know how much. What follows is one of the most quietly intense scenes in the whole story, and almost nothing physical happens in it. Paul puts his hand in the box. At first, there is only a faint warmth. Then the warmth becomes heat, and the heat becomes burning. And the burning grows until it feels exactly as though the skin of his hand is curling and blackening and cooking away, as though his flesh is being destroyed inch by inch. Every animal part of him screams to rip his hand out and save himself from the fire. And the needle waits at his neck, promising death the instant he obeys that scream. He has to sit perfectly still, hand in the box, while his own body roars at him that it is being burned alive. The old woman is not testing whether Paul is brave in some simple way. She is testing whether he is, in the deepest sense, human. As she explains it, an animal caught in a trap will chew off its own leg to escape, because an animal is ruled completely by the instinct of the moment, by the blind need to flee pain right now. A human being, she says, is something that can override that instinct. A human can hold still inside the fire, can refuse the screaming demand of the body, can keep command of itself for the sake of something larger than the panic of the moment. The test sorts the two apart. Those who yank their hand from the box are run by their instincts like animals. Those who can keep it there have a self strong enough to rule the animal inside them. And that, in her eyes, is what it means to truly be a person. Paul survives the test, and the way he survives it is the heart of this whole section. He does not grit his teeth and simply suffer through it by brute stubbornness. He uses a tool his mother taught him, a short set of calming words passed down through the sisterhood. Words meant to be spoken silently in the mind at the moment terror tries to take over. The words tell him to refuse the fear, to name it for what it is, which is the thing that destroys clear thinking. They tell him to let the fear move through him and pass on by, rather than fighting it or being swept away by it. And they promise that once the fear has gone, he will still be there, whole and clear, the calm self remaining after the storm has blown through. The most famous line of those words has slipped out of the book and into the wider world, repeated by people who have never read a page of Dune. Fear, the saying goes, is the killer of the mind. It is a small idea and a large one at the same time. Fear does not only make a person uncomfortable. Fear shuts down the clear thinking part of a person and hands the controls to the panicking animal part, the part that cannot reason, cannot plan, cannot judge, and will do almost anything to make the fear stop. A frightened mind is a mind that has stopped working as a mind. And the calming words are a way of refusing that shutdown, of keeping the thinking self in the driver's seat, even while the body is begging to flee. Herbert drew this idea from old practices, far older than any science fiction, that taught people how to quiet and master their own minds. The calming words work much like those practices. A person does not try to crush their fear or pretend it is not there, since fighting fear usually only feeds it. Instead, they acknowledge it, let it rise, let it move through them, and let it pass, watching it go without being carried off by it. What remains afterward is a clear and steady mind, able to see the real situation and choose a real response, rather than a panicked animal thrashing in a trap. It is a discipline of the inside, a power aimed not at the world, but at oneself. This inward power is unlike every other power in the book in one crucial way. It cannot be used to rule anyone else. A throne can be sat upon by a tyrant. A planted faith can be used to enslave a people. A precious resource can be used to choke a civilization. The gift of seeing the future can be used to lock a whole species in a cage. Each of those powers reaches outward and grabs hold of other people. The mastery of one's own fear reaches only inward. It makes the person who holds it stronger, clearer, freer, and it does nothing at all to the people around them. It is a power that cannot become a chain, because there is no one on the other end of it to bind. That is why Herbert seems to hold it apart from all the rest, with something close to respect. Through the whole long story, he warns again and again about the dangers of power over others, in every form it takes, until a reader might think he distrusts power itself. He does not distrust this one. The discipline of self-mastery is shown, over and over, as genuine and admirable strength, the thing that lets a person stand steady when everything around them is screaming. And it connects directly to the plea he made from the very beginning, the plea to keep your own judgment and never hand it away. A person ruled by fear cannot keep their judgment, because fear takes the judgment away and replaces it with panic. Only a person who can master their own fear can hold on to a clear and thinking mind. And only a clear and thinking mind can refuse to be stampeded into kneeling before a savior. This is the quiet thread that ties the inward power to the whole warning. Look back at how crowds hand themselves over to a shining leader. And underneath the hunger for rescue, there is almost always fear. Fear of an enemy. Fear of the future. Fear of having to think for oneself in a frightening world. The powerful have always known this. They stir up fear on purpose, because a frightened people will reach for a strong man the way a drowning person reaches for any hand at all, and will not stop to ask where that hand is leading them. Fear is the lever that pries a people's judgment loose, and the calming words, the small inward discipline of facing fear and letting it pass, are the one thing that can keep the lever from working. Because a person who has mastered their fear cannot be so easily frightened into surrender. So the smallest power in the book turns out to be the guard standing in front of the largest danger. The mastery of one's own mind is what allows a person to remain a person in the face of terror, to keep their thinking self awake when the powerful are trying to switch it off, to look at the savior or the strong man or the planted faith with clear eyes instead of panicked ones. It is the practical, inward shape of the whole lesson. Beware of heroes, Herbert had said, and keep your own judgment. The calming words are a tool for doing exactly that, a way of holding on to the clear mind that makes keeping your own judgment possible at all. There is a sharp and uncomfortable irony folded into this, though, and Herbert built it in on purpose. The very sisterhood that preserved this beautiful inward discipline, that taught the calming words and the mastery of fear, was the same sisterhood that planted false faiths across the worlds and used the hunger and fear of whole peoples to control them. They held the one genuinely admirable power in the story, the power over the self. And they used their own mastery to become the greatest manipulators of others the universe had ever known. The same steadiness that let them face death without flinching also let them lie without a flicker, bend a listener's will with a shaped voice, and steer history from the shadows. A good inward power, in their hands, became the engine of a vast and patient deceit. That irony deepens the lesson rather than spoiling it. The mastery of fear is a true strength and a real good, but like any strength, it can be turned to cruel ends by those who choose to. What matters is what a person aims it at. Aimed inward, at keeping one's own mind clear and free, it is the guard that protects judgment. Aimed outward, at stripping clear judgment away from others, it becomes one more tool of control. The sisterhood proved both halves of this at once, holding the antidote in one hand while spreading the poison with the other. And Herbert lets that contradiction sit unresolved, because the world really is like that. The same discipline that can free a person can, in different hands and with different aims, help enslave a multitude. For Paul, in that first small room, the inward power was still clean. He was only a frightened boy mastering his own terror to survive a test, using the calming words to hold his hand in the fire and keep his thinking self alive. It was the best thing about him, the strength that was truly his own, one inside his own mind and used against no one. Everything that came after, the visions and the armies and the throne and the holy war, was power over others, and all of it corrupted and trapped him. The one power that never harmed anyone was the small inward one he showed in that opening scene, before the world ever got its hands on him. There is a quiet sadness in the way the story moves from that clean inward strength, outward, into all the tainted powers that destroyed his peace. The whole of Herbert's warning can be folded down into the space between those two kinds of power. Power over oneself, the mastery of fear and the keeping of a clear mind, is the kind worth having. the kind that protects a person's freedom and their judgment and harms no one. Power over others, in all its grand and seductive forms, is the kind that corrupts the holder, traps the gifted, enslaves the trusting, and burns whole worlds. A life and a society go well to the degree that people keep the first kind and refuse to hand themselves over to anyone wielding the second. That is nearly the entire teaching of the book, hidden in a small room with a box and a needle on the very first pages. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The calming words teach a person to keep command of their own mind and never give it away. But long before Paul was born, humanity had done the opposite on the grandest scale imaginable, handing its thinking over to machines built to judge and decide so that people would not have to. What that ancient surrender did to the species, and the stranger trap humanity fell into the moment it thought it had escaped, is where this story comes to rest. Section 10. The gods we built to replace the machines. Long before Paul was born, long before the sisterhood planted its faiths or the emperors carved up the worlds, humanity made the largest mistake it had ever made, and the whole strange shape of the Dune universe grew out of how it tried to fix that mistake. In the deep past, thousands of years before any of the events of the story, people had built machines that could think. Not simple tools, but thinking devices. Machines clever enough to reason and decide and judge. Machines that could do the hard mental work of running a civilization. And little by little, because it was easier, because it was comfortable, because the machines were so very good at it, humanity handed its thinking over to them. People stopped deciding for themselves and let the machines decide. They stopped judging for themselves and let the machines judge. They leaned on the thinking machines the way a tired person leans on a wall. And slowly, the wall became a cage. What exactly happened in those dark centuries, Herbert kept deliberately vague, leaving it as a shadow at the edge of his world rather than a story told in full. What he made clear is the ending. Humanity, having nearly lost itself to the machines it had built to think for it, rose up at last in a great and terrible revolt. People remembered it afterward almost as a holy war, a furious uprising in which the thinking machines were hunted down and smashed and destroyed across every world until not one of them remained. And out of that revolt came the highest law of the New Age, a law carved into the holy book of Herbert's world and treated as the most sacred commandment of all. No one, ever again, was to build a machine made in the likeness of a human mind. That single law sits underneath everything else in the entire saga, like the foundation beneath a vast building. Every strange feature of the Dune universe, all the things that make it feel so unlike our own future, traces back to that one ancient ban. Because there were no thinking machines to do the hard mental work anymore, humanity had to find another way to get that work done. And the only material left to work with was people. So humanity turned itself into the machine it had destroyed. This is where the whole world clicks into place. With the thinking machines gone, people trained other people to do what the machines once did. They raised certain humans from childhood to be living computers, training their minds to calculate and reason and store vast amounts of information with a speed and precision that the old machines had once provided. These human computers became some of the most valued people in the universe because they were the closest thing left to the banned devices, only made of flesh and trained will instead of metal. Humanity had outlawed the thinking machine and then rebuilt it inside human skulls. The sisterhood was part of this same answer. They developed the powers of the human mind and body to astonishing heights. The deep memory, the fine control, the sharp judgment, all the abilities people had once been content to let machines handle. And the pilots who steered the great ships between the stars, the ones examined earlier, were another piece of the same puzzle. With no thinking machines to plot the safe course through the dark, humanity needed minds that could see the path ahead. And so it turned to the spice, which woke that seeing in certain people and let them do by sight what the machines had once done by calculation. The entire desperate dependence on the spice, the substance that everything in the universe came to rest upon, grew directly out of the choice to ban the machines. To get rid of one master, humanity bound itself to another. So the ancient revolt against the thinking machines did not free humanity in the way the revolt imagined. It traded one kind of dependence for several others. The machines were gone, but now whole peoples depended on human computers, on the sisterhood, on the pilots, and above all, on the spice that made the pilots possible, which meant they depended on whoever controlled the sand. The hand that had been reaching for the machines simply reached somewhere else. And this is the first hint of the deepest and darkest idea in all of Herbert's work. The idea he had been building toward through every single piece of this story. Look closely at what that ancient war was really against, and it stops being a war about machines at all. The thinking machines were dangerous to humanity for one reason above all others. They invited people to stop thinking. They offered to carry the heavy burden of judgment, to make the hard choices, to decide what was true and what to do, so that ordinary people could set that burden down and rest. The real disease was never the metal and the circuits. The real disease was the human willingness to hand its own judgment to something else and be relieved of the weight of thinking for itself. The machines were simply the thing humanity happened to hand its judgment to first. The revolt smashed the machines. It did nothing at all to cure the willingness. And so, having banned the machines, they had handed their thinking to. Humanity turned around and handed its thinking to something else. It handed its thinking to God kings. It handed its thinking to planted faiths and prophets and saviors. It handed its thinking to the certainty of leaders who spoke with total confidence, to the comfort of being told what was true, to the warm relief of letting someone wonderful carry the burden of choice. The same hunger that had once built the thinking machines and crawled inside their cage now built gods instead and knelt down before them. Humanity had fought a holy war to free itself from one master, and immediately, eagerly, went looking for a new one to obey. This is the thread that runs through every single thing this story has followed. And seeing it whole is like watching scattered pieces snap together into one picture. The crowd that hands its judgment to a shining leader is doing the thing the machines once tempted people to do. The people who kneel before a planted faith are doing it. The worshippers who build their savior into a god and then follow him into slaughter are doing it. The whole civilization that lets its survival rest on one substance from one source is doing it. The desert people who pour their trust into an outsider savior are doing it. Every form of surrender examined across this entire story is the same surrender, wearing different masks. It is the surrender of one's own judgment to something outside oneself, the laying down of the heavy burden of thinking, the search for a master who will carry it instead. Herbert poses the hardest question of his whole life's work right at this point, and he poses it without flinching. Is there really any difference, he asks, between handing your thinking to a machine and handing it to a prophet? The machine and the God King both offer the same bargain.
Both say, in effect, you do not have to decide anymore. You do not have to judge anymore. You do not have to carry the fearful weight of choosing for yourself, because I will carry it for you. Just trust me. Just obey. Just stop thinking and let me think for you. And humanity, again and again, across machines and emperors and saviors and faiths, keeps taking that bargain. Because the bargain feels like rest, and the burden of one's own judgment is so very heavy to carry alone. The terrible thing the ancient revolt reveals is that you cannot cure this hunger by destroying whatever it happens to be feeding on at the moment. Smash the machines, and the hunger finds a God King. Topple the God King, and the hunger finds a prophet. Expose the prophet, and the hunger finds a new certainty to kneel before. The disease is not in the thing being worshipped. The disease is in the worshiping, in the willingness, in the deep and human longing to be relieved of the duty of thinking for oneself. Humanity in Dune keeps winning its wars against its masters, and keeps losing the only war that matters. The quiet inward war against its own desire to have a master at all. This is exactly why the small inward power from before, the mastery of one's own fear, and the keeping of a clear mind, turns out to be the only real answer the whole story offers. Every grand solution fails. Banning the machines failed. Crowning a good leader failed. Even the God King's monstrous 3,000-year lesson was only a desperate attempt to shock humanity out of the hunger by force. And it worked only by making the hunger so painful that people finally turned against it. The lasting answer was never going to come from outside, from the right ruler, or the right law, or the right revolt. It can only come from inside each person, from the discipline of keeping command of one's own mind, refusing the comfortable bargain, and carrying the weight of one's own judgment, no matter how heavy it gets. The cure for handing your thinking away is the simple, difficult, lifelong refusal to hand it away. Herbert was not writing only about a far future of banned machines and desert worms when he buried this idea at the root of his universe. He was writing, as he always was, about us. He had watched his own world begin to lean on its machines, begin to let its leaders and its experts and its comfortable certainties do its thinking for it. Begin to reach for anything that would lift the burden of judgment off ordinary shoulders. He set his warning thousands of years in the future and dressed it in spice and sandworms and god emperors. But the bargain at the center of it is the same bargain offered to every person in every age. Stop thinking. Trust the master. Let something else carry the weight. And Herbert spent 6 books and a lifetime begging people to refuse that bargain, in whatever shape it came to them. What makes the warning land so hard is that the bargain almost never looks like surrender from the inside. The people who handed their thinking to the machines surely felt sensible and modern, glad to be free of tedious work. The crowds who knelt before their savior felt faithful and hopeful, glad to belong to something larger. The civilization hooked on the spice felt prosperous and connected, glad of all the worlds the spice held together. Nobody experiences the moment of handing away their judgment as a tragedy. It feels like relief, like wisdom, like trust, like love. The surrender wears the face of every good and warm feeling a person can have, which is precisely why it is so hard to see and so hard to refuse. The hunger to stop thinking disguises itself as the best parts of being human. So the whole vast machinery of Dune, all its empires and prophecies and wars across the stars, comes down at last to a single quiet warning about a single, quiet act. Beware the moment you decide to stop thinking for yourself. Beware the relief of letting a leader, a faith, a machine, a certainty, anything at all, carry the burden of your own judgment. That relief is the oldest trap there is, older than the Desert War, older than the God Kings, older even than the banned machines, because it lives inside the human heart and travels with people wherever they go. Every master humanity has ever bowed to, metal or flesh or holy, was only the latest answer to a hunger people carry in themselves. The hunger to be saved from the hard and lonely work of thinking and choosing and being responsible for their own lives. The genius and the sorrow of Herbert's whole story is that he refuses to tell anyone they are safe. He does not promise that the right system will fix it, or that humanity learned its lesson, or that the danger lies only in obvious tyrants and obvious villains who are easy to spot and easy to hate. He insists that the danger lives in the gentlest and most ordinary impulse, the wish to trust someone wonderful and rest. He insists that a free people is not a people that has destroyed its masters, since destroying masters is easy and humanity does it again and again. A free people, in his eyes, is a people that has each, one by one, in the privacy of their own minds, refused to want a master in the first place. That kind of freedom cannot be won in a war or written into a law. It has to be kept awake, daily, inside each person, like a small flame guarded against the wind. This brings the long warning all the way back to where it began. The first lesson was beware of heroes, and keep your own judgment. Everything since has been Herbert turning that single idea in the light, showing it from every angle, following it through crowds and thrones and faiths and visions and tyrannies and resources and saviors and machines, proving over and over that the shape of the danger never really changes, no matter what mask it wears. The hero is dangerous because people stop thinking and follow him. The throne corrupts because people hand it too much. The faith enslaves because people believe without asking who made it. The vision traps because people trust certainty over freedom. The tyrant rules because people would rather be ruled than carry themselves. The spice binds because people let their lives rest on it. The Savior conquers because people give him their judgment along with their love. And the machines, the very first master of all, were destroyed and then quietly rebuilt in 100 new forms, because the hunger that built them was never touched. There is one place this ancient warning reaches that no sandworm ever crawled and no god-emperor ever ruled. And it is the place where everything Herbert spent his life trying to say finally comes home. It reaches out of the book entirely, past the spice and the desert and the far future, and into the ordinary world of the people quietly listening to his story. A world that has its own machines, now offering to think for it. Its own confident leaders offering to carry its judgment. Its own comfortable certainties offering the old sweet bargain of rest. How the warning Herbert buried in a desert thousands of years in the future speaks directly to the choices waiting in every ordinary life today is where all of this, at long last, comes to rest. If you enjoyed this video essay, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.